The dust swirled around Ilara's worn boots, a gritty testament to the barrenness of her life, a life now laid bare on the crude auction block. Sold. The word was a brand upon her soul, searing deeper than any physical mark. Her supposed crime, whispered with sanctimonious pity and harsh judgment, was infertility. Her husband, Thomas, a man whose fleeting affections had curdled into bitter resentment with each passing moon that brought no child, had cast her out. His family, eager to see him secure an heir, had arranged this final, public humiliation. A barren field yields no harvest, her former mother-in-law had declared, her voice like flint. She is of no use now. Ilara stood, hands bound loosely before her, head bowed not in submission, but in an attempt to shield herself from the leering eyes, the assessing glances that stripped away her dignity layer by layer. She was livestock, a failed broodmare. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice that dripped with feigned sympathy, extolled her few virtues, strong enough for labor, moderately skilled in husbandry, quiet. He carefully omitted the reason for her presence here, but the whispers from the crowd, like the rustle of dry leaves, carried the truth on the wind. Barren cursed no man wants a fruitless wife, each word was a stone, adding to the crushing weight on her spirit. Was this all she was? A vessel deemed empty, therefore worthless? Loneliness, a constant companion for years, wrapped its chilling tendrils tighter around her heart. Fear, sharp and cold, prickled at the edges of her resolve. What awaited her? Who would buy a woman discarded for her inability to bear children? A flicker of movement at the edge of the sparse crowd caught her eye. A tall man, still as a forest pine, watched. His features, sculpted by sun and wind, spoke of the native Modoc people. His dark eyes, unreadable and intense, were fixed on her, not with the predatory gleam of some, nor the pity of others, but with a profound, disquieting stillness. He was alone, yet carried an aura of quiet command. Ilara's breath hitched. His gaze didn't feel like the others, it was different, searching, perhaps. Or was it just another curiosity, another judgment in a new form? She quickly looked away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of despair. The auctioneer, sensing a lull, bellowed, "What am I bid for this woman, Ilara?" Sound of limb, if not of womb. Good for domestic duties, a strong back for the field. A coarse laugh erupted from a grimy trapper near the front. $5 for the labor, he sneered, his eyes crawling over Ilara with an insolence that made her skin crawl. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her. $5. The price of a worn-out mule. Another bid, slightly higher, from a stern-faced farmer's wife likely looking for cheap help. The bids were desultory, reflecting her perceived lack of value. Ilara closed her eyes, a silent prayer escaping her lips, not for rescue, for she believed herself beyond that, but for strength to endure whatever came next. $10. The trapper again, his voice edged with a possessive growl. Ilara flinched. The auctioneer tried to whip up more interest, his words a hollow echo in the oppressive silence. A fine woman, gentleman, despite her misfortune. $10, going once. Just as the gavel was about to fall, a new voice cut through the air, calm and deep, carrying an unexpected authority. $20, all heads turned. It was the Modoc man. He had moved slightly forward, his posture unwavering, his dark eye still fixed on Ilara. A ripple of surprise and unease went through the crowd. Whispers erupted, the Modoc. What does he want with her? He has children, doesn't he? A whole passel of them. Ilara's eyes flew open, meeting his gaze. There was no cruelty there, no lust, only a strange, solemn intensity. The trapper scoffed. What's a redskin want with a white woman, less she's already spoilt goods? Cale, for that was his name, though Ilara did not know it yet, ignored him. His gaze remained on Ilara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, though she could not decipher its meaning. The auctioneer, momentarily flustered, recovered. $20 from the Modoc gentleman. A fine bid. Do I hear 25? Silence. The trapper scowled but stayed quiet, intimidated perhaps by the warrior's stoic demeanor or the subtle shift in the crowd's mood from derision to wary curiosity. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked around, a new eagerness in his voice. Sold. For $20, to the Modoc. Ilara swayed, her legs suddenly weak. Sold. Again. But this time, to a man whose intentions were a complete mystery, a man from a different world, a man who had looked at her not as damaged goods, but as something else. What, she could not imagine. Fear warred with a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of, not hope, but perhaps, a desperate question. Cale moved forward with a quiet grace, his worn leather boots making little sound on the hard-packed earth. He handed the $20, a significant sum, to the auctioneer, his face betraying no emotion. The crowd parted slightly as he approached Ilara, their earlier hostility now tinged with a wary respect for the man who was known to be formidable, yet fair. He reached her and, with a single, deft movement of a knife she hadn't seen, cut the coarse rope binding her wrists. Her hands fell limply to her sides, chafed and sore. She rubbed them, her gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet his eyes. "You will come with me," he said, his voice low and even, not a command, but a statement of fact. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His English was clear, with a slight, musical intonation. Ilara nodded, a small, jerky movement. What choice did she have? He turned and began to walk, and she followed, a step or two behind, like a shadow. He offered no explanation, no reassurance. As they left the judgmental eyes of the settlement behind, he retrieved a horse and a sturdy-looking pack mule from where they were tethered. He had a bedroll and some supplies. He gestured for her to mount the mule. It was not a comfortable ride, but it was better than walking. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the plodding of hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Ilara stole glances at him. His profile was stern, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He was a man of the wilderness, at home in its harsh beauty. After what felt like hours, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they arrived at his homestead. It was a simple log cabin, sturdily built, nestled in a small, sheltered valley with a clear stream running nearby. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a welcoming sign. But Ilara's heart clenched. Children. She could hear their voices, high-pitched and lively, before she saw them. 5 of them. They spilled out of the cabin as Cale dismounted, their initial exuberance dimming slightly as they caught sight of Ilara, a stranger, perched awkwardly on the mule. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 13 with his father's serious eyes, Chayton, stood protectively in front of the others. A girl, Winona, a year or 2 younger, watched her with an unnerving, intelligent gaze. Another girl, Tala, around 9, with bright, curious eyes, peeked from behind Winona. A smaller boy, Matu, perhaps 7, clutched Chayton's leg, his face half hidden. And the youngest, a little girl, Ayasha, no more than 5, with wide, innocent eyes, pointed a chubby finger. "Papa, who is she?" she asked, her voice clear in the sudden quiet. Cale looked at his children, then his gaze briefly met Ilara's. The stark reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She, the barren woman, brought to a home teeming with motherless children. What cruel irony was this? That first night, Ilara lay on a simple pallet Cale had prepared for her in a small alcove off the main room. It was separated by a heavy blanket hung for privacy, a small gesture of consideration that she clung to. Sleep was a distant shore, her mind a turbulent sea of fear and bewilderment. The cabin was filled with the soft sounds of the children breathing, a constant reminder of her own perceived failings and the unknown role she was meant to play in this family. Cale had said little, merely showing her where she could wash in the stream and offering her a share of their simple evening meal, a hearty stew she suspected he had prepared. He treated her not as a servant, nor as a wife, but as a guest, albeit one who had been purchased. The children had watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity during supper. Ayasha, the youngest, had smiled shyly at her once, a fleeting moment of warmth in the otherwise cool reception. Winona's gaze was analytical, missing nothing. Chaitan remained aloof, his young face set in lines of premature responsibility. Mata had hidden behind Kale whenever Ilara looked his way, while Tala had openly stared, her head tilted. Ilara knew she was an intrusion, a disruption to their lives. The next morning, she awoke before dawn, the ingrained habits of a lifetime of service urging her to rise. The cabin was quiet. Kale was already outside, she could hear the distant sound of an axe. Driven by a need to be useful, to prove she wasn't entirely without worth, Ilara set about tidying the main room. It was clean but cluttered, the inevitable result of a widower raising 5 children. She found a worn broom and swept the wooden floor. She neatened the scattered collection of wooden toys and mending. By the time the children began to stir, the fire was rekindled, and the aroma of warming leftover stew, thin though it was, filled the small space. Ayesha was the first to approach, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She saw Ilara by the hearth and paused. Ilara offered a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said softly. Ayesha toddled closer, drawn by the warmth of the fire. Winona appeared next, her eyes taking in the tidied room, a flicker of surprise in their depths before her expression became guarded again. Chaitan entered with Matu, both boys stopping short when they saw Ilara tending the fire as if it were her right. Tala bounced in, ever inquisitive. "Papa let you make the fire?" she asked bluntly. Before Ilara could answer, Kale entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the room, lingering for a moment on Ilara. He merely nodded, a silent acknowledgement. There was no praise, but no disapproval either. Ilara felt a tiny seed of purpose begin to sprout in the desolate soil of her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a place here, not as a wife or a mother, but as someone who could ease their burdens, even a little. Days turned into weeks. Ilara settled into a quiet rhythm, her life measured by the needs of the household and the changing moods of the children. She rose early, tending the fire, preparing simple meals from their stores of dried beans, cornmeal, and the occasional game Kale brought home. She found a stash of worn clothing and, with a needle and thread Kale provided from his late wife's small sewing kit, she began to mend. Her stitches were neat and strong, a skill honed over years. She patched Chaitan's torn breeches, resewed a seam on Winona's dress, and even fashioned a small, soft doll for Ayesha from scraps of fabric, stuffing it with dried grasses. Ayesha, true to her open nature, was the first to completely accept Ilara. She would follow her around the cabin, chattering about her day, offering Ilara smooth stones from the creek or wildflowers picked near the woods. Ilara's heart, so long constricted by sorrow, felt a gentle thawing in the child's innocent affection. Winona remained observant, her initial suspicion slowly giving way to a grudging respect as she watched Ilara's consistent, quiet care. She noticed the small improvements, the bread, though coarse, was less likely to be burnt, the mended clothes lasted longer. Tala, with her endless curiosity, often peppered Ilara with questions about her past, which Ilara answered simply and honestly, omitting the rawest details of her shame. Matu, shy and sensitive, began to offer Ilara hesitant smiles, especially when she praised his clumsy attempts to help her gather kindling. Chaitan, the eldest, remained the most reserved. He was his father's shadow, fiercely protective of his younger siblings. He watched Ilara with a solemnity that mirrored Kale's, his trust hard-earned. One afternoon, little Ayesha, playing near the woodpile, took a tumble, her joyous shrieks turning into wails of pain. Ilara was there in an instant, scooping the crying child into her arms. Ayesha's knee was scraped and bleeding. Without hesitation, Ilara carried her inside, gently washed the wound with clean water, and applied a soothing poultice of crushed herbs she recognized from her own mother's remedies. Her touch was firm but gentle, her voice calm and reassuring. Winona stood by, watching intently as Ilara skillfully bandaged the small knee. When it was done, Ayesha's sobs had subsided to sniffles, and she clung to Ilara, burying her face in her shoulder. Ilara held her close, rocking her slightly, a profound ache and a strange sense of fulfillment coexisting in her chest. Kale entered later, Chaitan having relayed the incident. He saw Ayesha, now sleeping peacefully on Ilara's pallet, her bandaged knee propped on a pillow. He looked at Ilara, his dark eyes holding a new softness. "She is well?" he asked. Ilara nodded. "Just a scrape." She was brave. He gave a slight nod, a silent thanks that spoke volumes. That evening, as Ilara mended by the firelight, Cale spoke more than he usually did, telling her of a deer he had tracked, of the signs of changing seasons. It was a small thing, but it felt like a bridge being built, stone by quiet stone, across the chasm of their different worlds. The small settlement, a day's ride from Cale's homestead, was a necessary evil for acquiring supplies they couldn't produce themselves: salt, sugar, flour, and occasionally, cloth or tools. On their first trip together, with Chaitan and Winona accompanying them for the experience, Ilara felt a familiar dread curdle in her stomach. As they walked down the dusty main street towards the mercantile, she felt the eyes upon her. Faces hardened, whispers followed them like biting flies. "That's her, the barren one bought by the Modoc, ain't she?" Shameless, living out there with him and his brood, each comment was a fresh stab to her already wounded soul, stripping away the fragile sense of peace she had begun to cultivate. Her steps faltered, her gaze dropping to the dusty boardwalk. She felt Cale's presence beside her, a solid, unyielding wall. He didn't quicken his pace or look at the gossips, but his hand subtly moved to rest on the handle of the knife at his belt. It wasn't a threat, more a silent statement of his readiness to protect his own. He guided her into the mercantile, his broad shoulders shielding her from the worst of the stares. Inside, the storekeeper, a man named Henderson, was civil enough, his dealings with Cale born of long, if sometimes wary, acquaintance. While Cale negotiated for flour and salt, Winona, her young face unusually tight, stayed close to Ilara. Chaitan, however, had wandered near the doorway, pretending to examine a display of horseshoes. His ears, though, were sharp. Ilara saw his shoulders stiffen as a pair of women outside, their voices carrying clearly, discussed her situation with relish. Imagine, sold like cattle because she couldn't give her husband a son. And now shacked up with an Indian. What kind of woman is she? Chaitan's head whipped around, his eyes flashing with a protective anger that startled Ilara. He looked directly at her, a question, a hurt, in his young gaze. Later, on the ride home, the silence was heavy. Chaitan rode ahead, his back ramrod straight. When they made camp for the night, he avoided Ilara's eyes. As she dished out the simple meal, he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Why did they say those things about you, Ilara?" Ilara's heart ached. She looked at Cale, who met her gaze, his expression unreadable but steady, leaving the choice to her. She took a deep breath. "Because," she said, her voice low but clear, "my first husband, and his family, they believed a woman's only worth was in bearing children. When I could not, they sold me." She didn't elaborate on the auction, on the shame. Winona looked down at her plate, her expression somber. Ayasha and Mata were too young to fully understand. Chaitan stared into the fire. "Papa says a person's worth isn't in what they can make, but in their heart," he said, more to himself than to anyone. Ilara looked at Cale, a flicker of gratitude warming her. His quiet teachings were her shield too. The chill of autumn was yielding to the deeper cold of early winter when Cale, while mending a section of fence far from the cabin, had a mishap. A heavy log, slick with frost, had slipped, striking his leg with bruising force. He managed to limp home, his face pale and drawn, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. Ilara saw him struggling across the clearing and rushed out, her heart lurching with alarm. Chaitan, ever watchful, was by his father's other side in an instant. Together, they helped Cale into the cabin and onto his cot. His trouser leg was torn, revealing a rapidly swelling, discolored shin. The pain was evident in the tight lines around his mouth, though he bore it with his usual stoicism. "It is nothing," he grunted, but Ilara could see it was more than that. Without a word, she went to work. She gently cut away the fabric, her touch surprisingly sure. She sent Winona for clean water and rags, and Tala to fetch specific herbs she knew grew near the stream, comfrey for bone setting, willow bark for pain. The children, usually boisterous, were hushed and anxious, watching her every move. Ilara cleaned the wound, her expression focused. She examined the leg carefully, feeling for any break. I don't think it's broken, she said, relief in her voice, but badly bruised. It will need care. She prepared a poultice from the herbs Tala brought, her movements efficient. As she carefully applied it and bound his leg, Cale watched her, his dark eyes intent. For the first time, he seemed to allow himself to show his vulnerability, the pain he was in. When she was finished, she met his gaze. You must rest it, she said firmly. Chaitan and I can manage the outside chores. Over the next few days, Ilara became his nurse. She changed the poultice, brought him food and water, and kept the fire stoked against the growing cold. The children, seeing her unwavering care for their father, grew even closer to her. Chaitan, in particular, seemed to shed the last of his reserve, working alongside her to chop wood and check snares, discussing plans for the winter as if she were a trusted partner. One evening, as she sat by Cale's cot, rebandaging his leg, he spoke, his voice quiet. My wife, bright water, he began, and Ilara's hand stilled. She knew herbs too. She had a gentle touch, like yours. Ilara felt a blush creep up her neck. It was the first time he had spoken of his late wife in such a personal way. She was a good mother, he continued, his gaze distant. The children miss her, I know, Ilara whispered. They are good children, Cale. You have raised them well. A comfortable silence settled between them, deeper and more meaningful than any they had shared before. In his pain and her tending, a new layer of trust had been forged, a quiet intimacy that warmed Ilara more than the hearth fire. She was no longer just the woman he had bought, she was becoming something more, something vital to the heart of their small, unconventional family. The fragile piece of their growing connection was shattered by the arrival of a lone rider, his silhouette stark against the weak winter sun. Ilara was outside, scattering grain for the few chickens they kept, when she saw him approach. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through her. The man was Jedediah Thorne, her former brother-in-law, Thomas's older, greedier sibling. He was the one who had most vehemently insisted on her sale, his eyes always calculating, his heart seemingly made of stone. What could he possibly want here? Cale emerged from the cabin, his recovering leg still making him favor it slightly, Chaitan close behind him. Thorne reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the modest homestead with open disdain before settling on Ilara. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. Well. Ilara. Found yourself a new situation, I see. His eyes flicked to Cale, contemptuous and bold. Heard tales in the settlement. Didn't quite believe a Modoc would pay good money for another man's barren leavings. Ilara flinched as if struck. The word barren echoed with all its old cruelty. Chaitan stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the small hunting knife at his belt. Cale's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed, becoming chips of obsidian. State your business, Cale said, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. My business? Perhaps I've come to see if my former sister-by-law is being treated right. Or perhaps, his eyes gleamed with avarice, I heard you struck it rich, Indian. Found gold on this land, maybe? And now you're squandering it on her. He gestured dismissively at Ilara. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. He thought Cale was wealthy? His greed was as boundless as his cruelty. There is no gold here, Cale stated flatly. And she is under my protection. Thorne sneered. From what? From the truth? Everyone knows what she is. Worthless. My brother, Thomas, he's thinking of taking a new wife. A fruitful one. But he feels a certain responsibility. Perhaps, for a price, he'd be willing to take Ilara back. Save her from this degradation. The audacity of it, the sheer hypocrisy, stole Ilara's breath. Take her back? After casting her out like refuse? They merely wanted to extort money from Cale, believing him to be prosperous. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped her. What if Cale believed him? What if he, too, decided she was a burden not worth keeping, especially if Thorne continued to slander her name? The children had come to the doorway, their small faces etched with worry and confusion. Ayesha began to sniffle. Ilara wanted to run, to hide, but she was rooted to the spot, the weight of her past pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate the fragile new life she had found. A tremor ran through Ilara, but as she looked at the worried faces of Winona and Tala, at Mata peeking from behind Chaitan, at Ayesha's tear-streaked face, something shifted within her. It was a surge of protectiveness, a fierce, unfamiliar courage that burned away the icy grip of fear. This was her home now, these were her children in all but blood, and this man, Cale, had shown her a kindness she'd never known. She would not let Thorn destroy it. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin, and met Jedediah Thorn's malevolent gaze. "I am not worthless, Jedediah," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, carrying across the cold air. "And I will not be returning with you, not for any price. My life here is not a degradation. It is a blessing." Thorn looked taken aback by her defiance, a flicker of surprise in his cruel eyes. "Blessing?" "Living in a hovel with a savage and his half-breed brats," he spat, his voice laced with venom. Before Cale could react to the insult, Chaitan stepped forward, his young face a mask of fury. "He is our father. And Ilara is good to us." Winona, usually so reserved, added, "She takes care of us. Better than you ever would." Cale placed a calming hand on Chaitan's shoulder, though his own eyes were blazing. He looked at Thorn, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "You have insulted my children and the woman of my house. You are not welcome here. Leave now." Thorn's bravado seemed to shrink under Cale's implacable gaze. He was a bully, accustomed to preying on the weak, not confronting a man like Cale, who radiated quiet, unshakable strength. Still, his greed and arrogance made him push. "She was sold. She has no say. If Thomas wants her back, or compensation." "She was sold because your family discarded her for their own selfish reasons," Ilara interjected, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "You saw no worth in me then, and you see no worth in me now, only a means to what you imagine is Cale's wealth. There is nothing for you here, Jedediah. Nothing but your own shame." Cale stepped slightly in front of Ilara, a protective stance that spoke louder than any words. "The price was paid," Cale said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "She is mine. And she chooses to stay. Your claim is dust. Go, before you regret lingering." Thorn looked from Cale's resolute face to Ilara's newfound strength, to the united front of the children. He saw no fear, no weakness to exploit. His eyes darted around, perhaps finally realizing the foolishness of his venture. With a muttered curse, he yanked his horse's reins, turned, and galloped away, his retreat as undignified as his arrival. Ilara watched him go, the tension slowly draining from her, replaced by a profound sense of relief and a dawning realization of her own inner power. She had faced her past, and she had not broken. As Jedediah Thorn's figure disappeared over the rise, a profound silence descended, broken only by Ayesha's soft sniffles. Ilara knelt and drew the little girl into her arms, murmuring soothing words. Winona and Tala came to stand beside her, their small hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture of solidarity. Chaitan remained by his father, but his gaze on Ilara was filled with a fierce, newfound respect. Cale watched them, his expression unreadable for a moment, then a slow warmth spread across his features, softening the harsh lines. He walked over to where Ilara knelt with the children. He extended a hand, not to her, but to gently stroke Ayesha's hair. "He is gone," Cale said, his voice gentle. "He will not trouble us again." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes still bright with unshed tears, but also with a dawning sense of triumph. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For standing by me." Cale's hand moved from Ayesha's hair to rest lightly on Ilara's shoulder. His touch was warm, firm, a silent reassurance that went deeper than words. "You stood for yourself, Ilara," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "You have a strong spirit. I saw it that day, at the gift market." He stumbled slightly over the word, as if acknowledging the indignity of it. "And my children, they see it too." That evening, after the children were asleep, a quiet peace settled over the cabin. Ilara sat by the hearth, mending a small shirt for Matu, her hands busy, but her mind replaying the day's events. Cale sat across from her, oiling a piece of leather, the silence between them comfortable, charged with unspoken emotions. Finally, he put down his work. "Ilara," he began, his voice hesitant, a rare thing for him. She looked up, her heart quickening. "What Thorn said about barrenness, it means nothing to me," Ilara's breath caught. "It is not a woman's womb that gives her worth," Cale continued, his gaze direct and sincere. "It is her heart. Her kindness. Her courage. You have shown us all of these things." He paused, then rose, and came to sit beside her on the small bench. He took her hands, calloused from work but gentle, into his own. "My children, they love you. They have not known such care since Brightwater walked this earth." Ilara's vision blurred. "And I?" He struggled for a moment. "I have come to value you more than I can say. This home is brighter with you in it. My heart is lighter." Tears finally spilled over, tracing paths down Ilara's cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked at him, at this strong, quiet man who had seen past her scars, past society's cruel judgment, and found worth in her. "Oh, Cale," she whispered, her voice choked. I feel the same." He leaned closer, his expression tender, and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Then this is your home, Ilara," he said softly. "Truly. If you will have it. If you will have us." She could only nod, her heart too full for words. In the warm glow of the firelight, surrounded by the sleeping sounds of the children who had become her own, Ilara knew she had finally found not just a refuge, but a family, a love, and a profound, unshakable sense of her own true self. The barren woman sold at auction was no more. In her place was Ilara, beloved, respected, and home.